Yeah, I mean, we just do it like a celebrity interview on a late night talk show, and you're our celebrity guest.
Well, this is great. I can draw on all that experience being on talk shows. It's probably the closest I'll come, so this is great.
Well, hello, everybody, and thanks for joining this episode of the Pro Seminar. So our special celebrity guest for today is Ben Hallen. Ben is Associate Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship, as well as the Long Break Endowed Professor in Innovation at the University of Washington's Foster School of Business. He had previously served on the faculties at London Business School and University of Maryland. Ben earned his PhD at Stanford in 2007. His research focuses mostly on entrepreneurs' networks, as well as on venture capital and startup accelerators. He won the TIM division, Technology and Innovation Management division, Best Dissertation Award at the Academy of Management, and was a finalist for the Best Dissertation Award at the Business Policy and Strategy division, as well as a finalist for the Organization Science Dissertation Proposal Award. He was named to one of the Poets and Quant's Best 40 Under 40 Professors in 2017. Has numerous publications, five in Academy of Management Journal. There's not too many people who can say they have 5 or more AMJs. 2 in ASQ, and that's quite an accomplishment too. There's not many people who have 2 ASQs, as well as SMJ in Organization Science. He currently serves as an associate editor at SMJ, as well as serving on the editorial board of ASQ. Formerly served on the editorial boards of AMJ, SMJ, and Organization Science, and has been elected to serve in service positions for both the BPS division of the Academy of Management and Strategic Management Society. So everybody, please join me in welcoming Ben Hallen.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Thanks for joining us. It's terrific to have you on the Pro Seminar. You know, a question I usually start off with on these interviews is about how did you find your way into this profession in the first place, right? I like to say that I've never met a 10-year-old who said, "Mommy, I want to be a strategy professor or even an entrepreneurship professor when I grow up." So most people, I assume, have some kind of indirect pathway into this profession. I did notice that you did study electrical engineering and computer science and worked as a startup founder yourself. So I assume that there must be some story behind how you found your way into the profession of being a strategy professor. So in effect, you know, what I'm asking is what's a nice engineer like you doing in a crazy field like this?
Yeah, I think indirect summarizes it well. Thanks so much, Rich. So I was electrical engineer undergrad. While there, had started doing some research in what was a professor's lab, but also turned out to be a startup that was selling a product out of that lab. That got spun out. And so that was sort of the first taste of entrepreneurship. And one summer, I was both doing development for them, and I was asked to write the business plan as well. Which was an amazing experience. In retrospect, there's probably some broader lessons there about when you're having, your undergrad intern work on the business plan. That's maybe an interesting study separately.
Not an indicator that the business is a high priority to the lab.
Yeah, well, or where the focus was. I mean, this is the classic thing of you have the PhD level sciences and what they're focused on, and the complexity of the business aspect, which is maybe a preview of things to come. And so then a little later, the research I was doing out of that is working with the computer science department, and so had an opportunity to stay and do what graduate school in computer science. And that program was sort of open-ended, that you'd sort of enter and then figure out were you on a PhD track or a master's track. But I was really thinking I was going to do a PhD in computer science. And so I was studying computer graphics and software engineering and really enjoying that, but it's the dot-com era. And at the same time, I had some friends who had, were very interested in entrepreneurship. They had connected with the serial entrepreneur. They had some software. They thought they saw an opportunity. And I started doing some advising, and a little bit of advising led to a lot more advising. And so I really transitioned to where I was going to finish what was then decided was going to be a master's degree in computer science. But I was really spending all my time sort of trying to work on this startup. And the dot-com crash happened.
Right.
And so we had some angel investors. The angel investors said the more experienced founding CEO, COO should probably be doing other things with their time. So I got to make that call on the part of the board to inform them of that. And we set out trying to figure out what can we do. That we thought we were going to be doing enterprise sales. We were in sort of email. And we ultimately ended up pivoting into the newsletter space.
Okay.
We got on a track to what was going to be profitability. And it was going to grow, but it wasn't necessarily going to be massive. Didn't look that way. And so, which was great. I mean, my co-founders were very happy. This is going to be a great setup for them. And I started to decide what was next. I'd sort of already said, I'm going to wrap up this computer science master's degree. And so started deciding, and I was really missing that academic research. And at the same time, I'd gotten so interested in the business side of here. We had the technology, but it was all these business things of, we didn't really know how to do the sales. We maybe didn't have the right strategy. We had to position ourselves. And so I came across the program at Stanford in the engineering school. And I don't know if I would have applied if it had been outside of that. I don't know if I fully understood what I was applying to, but applied. They saw something in me. They accepted me. And I went out there and, was unsure of what is this? Am I going to be doing research and then try and find the next startup? But there I really fell in love with this process of, how can we do research that helps entrepreneurs be better and then teach that in the classroom? And so I really got passionate about that there. And then that has been the academic career.
Cool. So when you were at Stanford, so tell us a little bit about what your experience was like in the doctoral program there.
I mean, it was an amazing experience. I feel so fortunate with that. Kathy Eisenhart was my advisor.
Right.
So I learned so much, and I've had the opportunity to co-author with Kathy again recently. And that's just been a wonderful experience to come back and learn, now as my sort of capacity has increased to, learn even more. And so, Kathy Eisenhart, Rita Katsila, who I've co-authored with and learned so much from, and then we had Tom Byers, who is on the, I forget what Tom's official title is now, but Tom, real thought leader around the teaching of entrepreneurship. And so really learned a lot, working with Tom and how to influence practice. And he had a lot of entrepreneurial experience. And then Pam Hines was on the committee, but really took a broad variety of classes. And so my first classes were, over in the education school with Woody Powell. And, so for an engineer coming in and so these very sociological type classes, it was an eye-opener and took some time to sort of realize how all of this sort of comes together and connects.
Interesting. Okay. So at some point you decided to study entrepreneurs' networks for your dissertation topic. And I'm always curious to find out how people find their dissertation topic. What was it that attracted you to, or, made you think you should do a dissertation on entrepreneurs' networks?
Yeah, so initially my thinking was to explore, the initial topic I was looking at was how do entrepreneurs find their second product? I was really interested in this question and did some pilot interviews there, and so, my community was very gracious. They helped set up some interviews and, just wasn't seeing anything that was a big surprise. They sort of would look for things that were consistent with their vision, their mission statement. And so wasn't sure there was enough there to sort of hang a dissertation around. At the same time, just given my own background, I'd been TAing various entrepreneurship courses. And one of them was a course that I was TAing for a local venture capitalist, really fantastic venture capitalist, who was teaching this venture finance master's level course. And so I was TAing that, and was really seeing what we were teaching in the classroom. And I mean, we're teaching great stuff. And, it's been interesting to follow some of those students since what they've done with their careers. And I took the course and then I TA'd it and, but got a sense of, so we had a lot of things on like deal terms and the valuations.
Sure.
But we weren't talking a whole lot about how entrepreneurs actually raise funds. And I remember that being a really hard part of the process. And then also, I was involved in a community group at the time. And so was, helping lead this boys youth group, and was, one weekend at one of the homes we were having a get together for the group, and was talking to the father whose home it was at. And he asked me sort of, what I'm TAing and what I'm interested in. And I explained a little bit. And he's like, oh, I'm about to go raise funds. And I'm like, really? He's like, yeah, I'm going to write the business plan next weekend. It's like, really? He's like, yeah, I got this great book. And he goes upstairs and comes back with this yellow book, Business Plans for Dummies. And I'm like, we're teaching all this academic stuff. And you're like, oh, so that's what you're going to do? He's like, yeah, I'll crank out the business plan in a couple of hours. And then here's what I'm going to go do to raise funds. Now, and I start to think, and I look around, and, he's done well. He's a serial entrepreneur, a nice place. And it was all those other things he starts talking about, and the strategies of, if he bumps into someone at the grocery store, what's he going to say? What's he not going to say? How's he going to cue up the relationships? When's he going to engage? And that got me really interested of, hey, maybe we've taken these very finance-oriented angles on this. What about the process of raising funds? And is that an opportunity? And then that sort of led into the connection around maybe networks as a theoretical lens for understanding this. So it was a qualitative dissertation initially.
Right. So I know that one of the big challenges that doctoral students sometimes face is it may be easier for them to find a dissertation topic than to narrow that topic down to a manageable research question, right? So, and in order to actually execute a PhD dissertation, you really need to have a manageable research question that you can answer in, say, 2 years, right? So how did that process go for you? How did you go from running into this guy who, happened to illuminate your thinking about the role of networks in raising money for entrepreneurs, to finding an answerable research question on that topic?
Yeah, so I did a large literature review, which was critical, and I've gone back to that literature review even now to sort of, and so really started on that process, and that was really grounded in the phenomenon of what do we know about venture finance, and so split it up into the entrepreneur side, the investor side. Try to synthesize that literature, and I can still picture this diagram in my head where it's sort of this table of here's what we know, and then there's a couple of boxes. I think it was a 2x3 of entrepreneurship and investor side, and then there was like sort of different lenses that the literature had taken, and there's various findings, and then also identified a set of gaps of here's some open questions and things we don't know. And so what I initially proposed was it actually was a pretty similar question of how can entrepreneurs best raise funds? And then that sort of evolved into this network lens framing, especially sending the paper out for publication, what ultimately became an AMJ in 2012, of, how can entrepreneurs more efficiently form ties? That ended up sort of being, where we narrowed it down. And some of that really came later as the paper developed, that we know a lot about which ties form, though there's a gap there that I'll elaborate on in just a second, but the efficiency of it.
Right. So I see that narrowing from, how do entrepreneurs raise money to the narrow question of what makes certain types of tie formation more efficient in terms of raising capital. So what was the biggest challenge for you in doing a dissertation on this topic?
One thing I should note is that then after I proposed, I had done this literature review, and I realized, well, there's sort of these preceding questions that actually are probably not best answered qualitatively. About, we don't know a whole lot, that we know founder history should matter, but sort of when does it matter more or less? And what about what you accomplish? And so ended up going and gathering a quantitative data set.
Okay.
In parallel to do that, really at the same time I was starting the interviews. And that actually ended up going faster, that I had those results and then had an R&R on that paper. So we shifted the dissertation so that it was mixed methods. And then my job market paper was quantitative. Okay.
So tell us a little bit about the challenges of managing a mixed method dissertation. Was that?
I think one thing that went well was keeping it, and I don't know if I appreciated this at the time, was 2 separate papers. And now we have this more standard sort of 3-paper model that was sort of less common with that group at the time. I think that shifted. But, 1 paper being qualitative, 1 quantitative, that did reduce sort of the complexity of how do you synchronize these 2 aspects. It'll let them sort of move independently and parallel and sort of build off of each other. So I think that, I don't think that was fully intentional, but that did end up working well. And then it also provided some diversification of, that, hey, the results happened to come out relatively cleanly. There was interest when I sent it off to a journal, and then I got an R&R. And then the qualitative took a little longer to find that right framing around the efficiency.
So you said that your job market paper was the quantitative paper, right? So
that's correct.
How did that work out for you in terms of, you think that was an advantage on the job market or a disadvantage on the job market to have made that choice?
Yeah, it's hard to know, and I don't have the counterfactual. In some ways, I think it was helpful for some schools do appreciate. I think a lot of schools were interested in the qualitative, and they like the combination of the quantitative. And so in many ways, that was very helpful. I think the field was going through a lot of change at the time as well. And so there was, sort of a methodological shift into, sort of identification and instruments. And, so there was definitely more of a learning curve as I then continued doing more quantitative work later. But, I've enjoyed it over the course of the career, and I've sort of come back to doing more qualitative work in recent years.
Very nice. So the topic that you study, or the topics that you study with venture capital, entrepreneurs networks, and startup accelerators, some of those have been studied for a while, and some of them are more new research topics. But either way, what do you think are the most important unanswered questions on those topics? What do we not know yet that we really should know about entrepreneurs networks, about venture capital, and about startup accelerators?
Yeah, let me take each of those separately. And I've had some great conversations today with many of you who are doing work in these areas. So in terms of networks, and we sort of tried to bring this together in an annals piece in 2020 with Jason Davis and Alex Murray of, if we sort of we wanted to take a step back. Jason been doing some parallel work more in big companies, just sort of say there's sort of these 2 perspectives on sort of entrepreneurial network evolution. And one is very sort of sociological, that really, what we call a structural localism perspective. That a lot of how your network evolves depends on what your network currently is and how you're embedded in various social structures. And that's very consistent with what we see in a lot of other contexts. But then there's this other perspective that different people have often been, there's a lot of different papers sort of touching on this, that if you read it, and it's not necessarily framed as or hadn't been framed as a stream, but we saw a lot of similarities in it. It's around this very agentic perspective, that there's a lot that entrepreneurs can come in and do, as people can in all contexts, but entrepreneurship is a great area for studying it, for really shape, what are the processes by which you can reshape networks in ways that would be unlikely to form otherwise. And so I think continuing to work in that sort of agentic perspective is a big opportunity. There's data challenges, because how do you capture processes? It's harder to capture observational data, which is like the classic, one great thing about network studies is we could get big archival data sets and do it. And so I think there's some open questions there. Do you do it with surveys? Do you, various other means, this like rich email data that you can infer things. So I think that's a big aspect, but I think getting into a lot of the process aspects of networks.
Yeah, I agree. I think there is so much research on networks, but so little research on networking.
Yeah, that's a great, and when does networking as a process matter? When does it not? I think there's some really interesting questions. How much do you want to keep your head down if you're a new entrepreneur and just say, okay, we got to accomplish some things first and then build our network. That sort of relates to, what else became the 2008 ASQ. And then this stuff I've been doing with accelerators, to sort of jump ahead a little bit, we're seeing, so I was initially interested in accelerators just the form of venture finance. But we started to get in there and you do these interviews and you're like, wow, they are learning a lot. Like the amount of money you get from an accelerator.
It's small, yeah.
It's small. Well, the accelerator initially determined it by, they had done PhDs. Paul Graham had done a PhD, and he called someone who's a professor. He's like, okay, how much do you fund PhD students for during the summer? And that's
Oh,
sort of how they benchmark it.
that was the threshold he had to meet?
That was the threshold. And so, which is, it's definitely solid funding, but you're not going out and hiring a number of employees.
Right, right. And you're also not taking much equity either.
They're not taking a huge amount of equity, but there's these learning structures are fascinating of like a very intensive mentoring. You have people combined with cohorts of peers. So all of these learning where we thought that might be more of a resource story became much more of a learning story.
Mm-hmm.
And so accelerators, I think there's a lot, I think we're getting some good understanding of the baseline effects of accelerators, but their role in the entrepreneurial ecosystem, how they're reshaping the network, or how entrepreneurs can apply these same practices themselves to accelerate their own learning. Or can you apply it in a big company?
Yeah, I love to use when I teach entrepreneurship, I love to use some of the Y Combinator YouTube videos that they have out there. And, some very good stuff there, some great guest speakers. But, Sam Altman, when he introduces these videos, he says in their estimation, maybe about 30% of the learning that they do at Y Combinator could be codified into these videos, right? And the rest of it is more non-codifiable, stuff, more tacit stuff. And I always wonder what that other stuff is, because that constitutes, according to what he's saying, 70% of the learning that takes place at Y Combinator.
Yeah, I mean, in the interviews, and this was really, Susan's dissertation data is Susan Cohen, my co-author. We see, she saw a lot of stuff where it's this combination of being told, you're learning how to do things, sort of entrepreneurial foundations, but there's a lot of then helping people refine what they plan to do. That you have this new business model, here's how we're going to go execute on it. And it's having people say, before you go experiment, before you run the lean startup test, hey, maybe you think about doing this marketing thing a little differently. Or you think you got the product down, but actually let's go revisit that.
Right. So it's not so much education as it is consulting at that level.
Yeah, I think that, and there's a learning aspect from it. We're doing some follow-on work, seeing if it carries over to future startups, and we're still analyzing those results right now.
Great topic. Great topic. So I'm sorry. So what are the unanswered questions with regard to accelerators?
Okay, so accelerators, I think there's a lot of how the impact for the broader ecosystem would be one. I'd say there's looking at how the practices extend elsewhere. I think examining heterogeneity in effects, are all exciting areas, and seeing some interesting working papers from others sort of coming through the pipeline.
Okay. And what about the more mature literature, let's say venture capital literature?
Yeah.
What do we not know? I mean, even after all these years of studying venture capital, what do we not know that we really should know?
What do we not know? I mean, we have pretty good indications that the average effect of venture capital investment is positive. Emina and I were just talking about this. There's some big opportunities for further understanding. Are they increasing risk as well? What are the possible downside, or what is there heterogeneity in effects? How do we understand what maybe drives that heterogeneity in effects? I think there's a lot of questions around the relationships between, sort of something analogous to what Jim Westfall did with sort of the board and public company CEOs, and Sam Garg has been doing some really cool stuff with. And so understanding those dynamics, I think, is really interesting. And then the venture capital landscape seems to have shifted in some key ways over the years. And so I think understanding that, and that has both just key practical implications and maybe some key theoretical implications.
Neat. So you've obviously been very successful at doing this, having had all those publications and getting so much traction, becoming an associate editor, being a respected leader in the field on the research on these topics. Are there, for the benefit of the doctoral students, were there any mistakes or regrets that you've made, either regrets that you've had or mistakes that you've made along the line where you say to yourself, well, I wish I had to do over it again, I would do this differently, or I would do that differently?
I would say there's definitely substantial learning curves to move down. And it's hard to figure out, how would you move down those learning curves otherwise? But there's some things, there's successes. There's a lot of times where it's hard to get papers through and things to learn. And and I've had the really good fortune to work with some really great people, but there's, there's a lot of things I had to learn further as, as methods were evolving as I came out. And then finding the right fit of like, how do we think about, identification and inference and things like that in sort of an entrepreneurial context where sometimes information is sparser. How do you think about the right portfolio of things? So, I think there is a degree of recognizing, I was in a junior faculty consortium this summer and, and was sort of, reflecting, I do advise recognizing there are going to be learning curves. And so there's value in one, just emotionally preparing for it. And then two, also recognizing sometimes sometimes it takes some time to find where your work fits and who's the right community. And, you may have a phenomenon, but how do you frame that theoretically and who are the right reviewers? And recognizing that one, that it's going to take time. And so don't hold on to the paper forever and then send it out thinking, okay, great, now it's going to go through. And sometimes it's just an experimentation and learning process. But there's value also in getting the friendly reads in that, but just accepting that that is part of the process and incorporating that feedback and also engaging that classic sort of exploratory aspect. We all know from sort of strategy of, as you're coming out, finding who is the right home, who's the right audience who's going to be interested in this and who I resonate with. And for me, there was questions like, is it the networking literature? Is it the entrepreneurship literature? Is it more like an OT? Is it, and I've probably shifted a little bit from, sort of if we're thinking about academy terms, sort of OMT, which I love reading that work. But, SMJ is where, I'm an associate editor, and maybe that's where, a little bit more of the focus at the moment.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like there was both a methodological learning curve for you and maybe a framing, positioning learning curve, right?
Yeah.
Did those, was either one of those harder than the other? And what were the toughest lessons to learn on each of those learning curves?
I think there's just the lesson of, recognizing it's going to take some trial and error with these papers and refinement. The papers definitely improved throughout the process. They're in some ways the methods are easier to sort of know that that's out there. That was a little easier in retrospect to see that shift was happening. I think that's something now I'm very careful to sort of try to pay attention to. What are the new methods coming down the pipeline? And Sarah saying, okay, how's this going to impact? Where is the bar, the expectation for papers a couple of years from now? But that's also a lot of fun of, the paper I presented this morning, we were doing some stuff with high dimensional data and how do we reduce it down, and it ends up being a small part of the paper, but it's really fun to get to learn those new methods.
Neat. So your research has evolved over time from, purely network based to, to more looking at the, accelerators and other aspects of the entrepreneurship phenomenon. Can you tell us a little bit about what led you to make those choices? What led you to make those changes in your focus from one project to the next? How do you get from, the dissertation student who gets excited about, having this conversation with a guy about his networking approach to raising money to the portfolio of different research interests you have today?
Yeah, so I think one lesson I've learned, and and I heard it from a couple of different people, and maybe I had to hear it from a couple of different people, but it's something I've very much come to appreciate. So my advisor, Kathy Eisenhart, talks about this, and then, I remember Kostas Markidis at, London giving this advice, really thinking in terms of streams and a couple of papers together. And, you think about like the managerial impact, which of course we all hope to have. And, there's questions of translation. We can talk about that later, but there's the question, that for one paper, you have to go pretty specific of what you're hoping to accomplish. And you're often gathering data, you're getting immersed in the literature. And so oftentimes, it's sort of what we're often looking to, or what I've learned, what I'm looking to accomplish, I may have to do over a couple of papers. And so how to stream that together. In terms of that shift, yeah, in some ways that was very serendipitous. I'd been teaching a venture finance class. I've done research on venture capital, and I started to have some students saying, hey, I'm doing this great MBA. How should I think about these accelerators? And my initial lens there was very much a network orientation. But then as I known Chris Bingham since my PhD days, and, he'd worked with Susan Cohen, and I know Susan for years as well. As we started working together, that really shifted from, there's probably network angles to that. And indeed, the paper I presented this morning was very much sort of a network take on it. but we ended up going in more of a phenomenon and slash organizational learning. And so that was sort of this transition. Working with co-authors also made that a lot easier. They're so embedded in that space. And then I've gone on to do some subsequent work around organizational learning with Ron Tidhar and Kathy Eisenhart recently.
Okay. And what's your next pivot? Where do you see yourself going in the future?
Oh, I'm really continue to be really interested in entrepreneur finance. I'm also really interested in how do entrepreneurs grow businesses. And I think this is a very continuous. I teach a course on strategies for funding and scaling. And, you raise funds because you want to scale the business, and you're able to raise funds because they think you can scale the business. Mm-hmm. And so I think continuing that iteration or that relationship of like, okay, great, you raised the money. What do you go do with it? And how do you think about that? And then that connects to all sorts of interesting strategy and organizational design questions.
And it sounds like a chicken and egg problem, right? Because you've got to probably demonstrate some scalability before you can get the funding, but you also need to get the funding before you can scale, right? So sounds like it's a chicken and egg problem for entrepreneurs.
A little bit of a chicken, and I think we have some good insights there. And the unfortunate answer for the entrepreneurs is that it doesn't really matter if you need the capital, you need to go out and demonstrate it first. And so that raises a whole host of questions. How do you do that? We know which has to come first. And then also interested in businesses that are going to scale, but not perceived as scaling enough to raise funds. And so doing some work in that area, what we're calling sort of mid-scale entrepreneurship.
Interesting. So you have now supervised, I think, 8 doctoral students of your own?
I've been on committees.
Okay. Been on committees. Fair enough. So
yeah, one of my own has graduated. Jen Reimer, who I don't think I could say on anything public what she's doing next year, but we're very, very excited and proud of Jen. Waiting for some things to be finalized. And
well, congratulations on whatever is soon to be announced. That sounds great.
Exactly right. So, and then working with Sung-Ho Park, who's co-author in the paper I presented this morning.
Okay, so you've been on the committees at least of 7 or 8 doctoral students. So you've had some experience supervising doctoral students in some capacity, rather. What is the most important piece of advice that you give to your own doctoral students?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd love to get your hear because you've asked that of so many people. The biggest thing
I'll probably put together a compilation video of all the answers to that question.
Yeah. And I don't know how effective I've been in articulating this. I would say, finding a combination of something that both is going to a dissertation topic that addresses a theoretical need and your own goals as well. And so something that you can be passionate about, whatever it is, because it's something you're really interested in, because of the practical implications of that. But also something that meets all those criteria of this can be a springboard to a stream of initial papers that is really going to help lay the foundation for a tenure packet, which I know is hard to think about when you're picking that as a doctoral student, but at least something that you can see studying stuff related to this for a number of years, but also recognizing the dissertation papers, it just has to be the start of it. And it has to get done. Like the most important thing about a dissertation ultimately is that it is finished.
It's finished, yes. Yeah. The only good dissertation is a finished dissertation.
That's right.
So, okay, so it sounds like your advice is somewhere like find the intersection of your passion and what's marketable.
I would say, I don't know if passion. I'm always a little, I think in entrepreneurship, many of us, have encountered, this, issues around passion sometimes, but something that you find interesting, that you see an interesting angle into, and which is marketable and tractable,
something that can keep you motivated, at least.
Exactly right.
Too strong, but
yeah,
something at the intersection of your motivation and the marketability.
Yeah, and that has all those right properties if we can find the right data for it and move it forward, and we can do a few follow-on papers.
And get some answers within a couple of years.
Yes, the right time period.
Nice. Well, let me throw it open to the audience in case anybody on the call has other questions they'd like to ask. Anyone? Be brave. No, nobody has any questions? Okay, well, I'm kind of out of questions. We're getting close to the end of the hour anyway. So let me just say thank you, Ben, for sitting for the interview and participating as part of our little celebrity talk show ritual. And we will get this up on YouTube as soon as we can.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you again for everyone with the talk this morning. And I just really enjoyed the opportunity to interact.